Hi, I'm Tom DeBevoise and I'm with Advanced Component Research. And today we're going to talk about models of regulatory compliance, specifically connecting source documents to process and decisions through concept models. So, source documents such as the Code of Federal Regulations are not written as software specifications. However, they have language that has to be precisely understood and followed. Some regulatory requirements will become processes, others decisions, others will be behavioral patterns within an organization. So modelers need to understand exactly how a particular regulation should be followed. We can use concept models in our modeling, and these concept models precisely communicate the ideas of the regulations. A concept model communicates business ideas in terms of nouns and verbs on a diagram. The nouns and verbs convey meaning, and this diagram is a map of the terms and the relationship based on the verbs. Also, concept models can create terms of the business rules of the regulation, and it can create the data model for your regulation. Process modeling and business process modeling notation BPMN or decision modeling in DMN can create the logic that exactly follows the business rules of this regulation. So let's explore some of these ideas using the Trisotech enterprise software. We'll start out in the knowledge entity modeler, which is a concept modeler based on SVBR, Semantic Vocabulary of Business Rules, which is an OMG standard. We'll look at a specific regulation and identify some processes and decisions, and we'll use the workflow modeler in BPMN to model one of the processes that we identify, and then we'll go into a little bit of detail in the decision modeler in DMN to model specific logic that's identified in our concept model. So let's get going with our demonstration. So let's look at a specific regulation. This regulation is shown on the Cornell School of Law Legal Information Institute, and it concerns swaps, which are agreements between two counterparties to exchange financial instruments, cash flows, or payments for a certain amount of time. The rules govern the amount of margin that is collected from or given to a counterparty, depending on the variation or change in the market value of the swap's asset class. So here is a concept model for the regulation we just looked at. And you can see at the center of this concept model, more or less, is the swap. And it's executed between a covered swap entity and a counterparty. A counterparty can be a financial end user or a swap entity, and that's defined by the ISA relation, which is the open-ended arrow relation. Variation margin amount is central to the compliance of this regulation. And the verb pursuant to 23.155 defines how it's calculated. And if we were to make a more thorough analysis of this regulation, we would probably have a concept model that would extend into the entities and verbs of 23.155. However, we have broken out the eligible collateral regulations, which are 23.156. An eligible collateral regulation can be cash security or a variation margin, and it's discounted by a standardized haircut schedule. Next, we want to break this concept model down into the business rules associated with the regulation. So let's go back to the regulations and look at the rules we need to develop to comply. Looking at Part A, initial obligation, I find that there are four basic business rules. The first is related to the time frame on or before the business day after the day of execution. The next business rule is related to collecting or posting the variation margin account to or from the counterparty. The third rule is computing the rule based on 23.155, and the fourth rule is in a form that complies with 23.156. So if I go back to the KEM and look at the business rules that I have entered, you can see that I have the four basic rules: the time frame, on or before the business day, after the day of execution, the collecting or posting the variation amount with the counterparty. The third rule, the variation amount computing pursuant to 23.155, and the variation margin amount that is in a form that complies with 23.156, which is collateral. So let's look at the next section, continuing obligation. The rules in continuing obligation are similar to the prior one, where we have a time frame rule, each business day until such unclear swap is terminated or expired. We have a rule about collecting or posting the variation margin amount with the counterparty, a rule for calculating it pursuant to 23.155, and a rule that says it complies with the form that is in 23.156. If you look at my KEM, I have these four rules here. Covered swap entity, collect or post the variation margin amount, calculated each business day until it terminates or expires, calculated pursuant to 23.155, and number four, complies with 23.156. So we have some obvious redundancies here. The calculation pursuant to 23.155 is redundant. We don't need two rules for that. And in a form that complies with 23.156 is another redundancy. I would also argue that collecting or posting the variation margin amount with the counterparty is another redundant business rule. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse it down to eliminate these redundancies. So here are the consolidated rules for complying with collection and posting of variation margin. We took the 8 rules that we developed in looking at the regulations and broke them down into these 5. And then rule number 6 here is related to the minimum transfer amount, which basically says that none of this applies unless the initial margin and variation margin is greater than $500,000. Now we're positioned to take these rules and turn them into either workflow or decision logic. So we're in the workflow modeler of the Trisotech enterprise software, and we're looking at the workflow that is detailed by the business rules we developed in the analysis of the regulation. You can see that the workflow starts with the execution of the swap, and the first gateway that occurs after that execution is the rule related to the time frame on or before business day after execution. If we don't comply, we're going to report that somewhere. But then the next step after that is decision logic related to 23.155, computing the variation margin. And then we have a gateway that implements the rule for the minimum transfer amount, which is $500,000. If we do have more than $500,000 in our variation margin amount, then we check to make certain that the collateral applies with 23.156, the forms of the margin. Then we have the workflow rule that says if the margin is negative, we collect the variation margin from the counterparty. Otherwise, we post the variation margin to the counterparty. Then we have the continuing obligation rule, which says for each time business day after that initial execution, if the swap has not expired or terminated, we continue to compute the variation margin amount and comply with the remainder of the regulations. So let's look at some of the decision logic that is associated with these regulations. We're going to focus in on 23.156, which is collateral associated with the forms of margin. So if I go back to the knowledge entity modeler, you can see I've entered the business rules associated with the forms of margin. And collateral can be submitted against a variation margin amount in the form of dollars, currency, or some type of security. And once we've submitted that, it needs to go through a haircut process, right, which is a computation that includes an 8% discount if you're submitting the collateral in a currency that is not the currency of settlement for the uncleared swap, and an additional discount according to this standardized haircut schedule. Let's look at that haircut schedule in terms. Down here, from basically the decision table that's in the regulation, we have a type of collateral, cash, eligible government or related debt, etc., and a percentage discount that needs to be applied as a haircut against that collateral. And rule number 3 computes the market value of the eligible collateral assets based on the haircut from that decision table. So let's look at the decision logic that implements those 3 rules. We're looking at the decision modeler of the Trisotech enterprise software. And this is a model in DMN, decision model notation. The first thing we want to discuss is the data that's driving the decision. And that data is this collateral basket. A collateral basket is a collection of collateral types. If I go to data type here, I can look at my collateral type, and we see that we have an attribute collateral type, and it has an enumeration that lists all of the different collateral types that drive that haircut schedule that we described. The next thing we want to look at is this compute margin for basket of collaterals. And that has what's known in Trisotech software a iterator. The iterator allows the business analyst to visualize the for statement and simplify understanding what it does. And in this case, it's looping through the collateral basket collection and applying the compute margin with margin discounts business knowledge model. So let's look at that. Here, the business knowledge model compute margin with margin discount implements the logic for the collateral rules we described. Opening it up, we've implemented that logic in what's known as a context. And a context in either a BKM or decision allows you to develop a list or a sequence of steps to follow as part of your decision model. And the first step we have here is the decision table that takes the collateral type and returns the haircut. The next step is the 8% discount where you've submitted collateral in a currency that's different than the base currency of the swap. And the next step after that is the formula that applies the haircut to the value of the collateral. So you can incorporate business rules and terms that you've created with the knowledge entity modeler into your decision models and workflow models. Right now, let's incorporate a business rule as a knowledge source into this decision model that we've been working on. The way that I do that is to call up the digital enterprise graph and look up my business rule and drag it onto the canvas. That business rule becomes a knowledge source that I can now connect to the logic that implements that source. You can also incorporate terms that you've created with the KEM into descriptions of the different elements of a decision or a workflow model. So let's go ahead and say we're computing the discount according to the standardized haircut schedule, which we created with the KEM. So I look it up with this dictionary shape, And here it is, haircut schedule, and I add it to the description of that item. So modeling regulations involve these 5 basic elements. First, we have the source document. And from this source document, we create a concept model of the area that's being regulated. From that concept model, we create an understanding of the terms associated with the source document. This leads to business rules that are needed for compliance. By looking at the atomic business rules of compliance, we're able to develop a workflow model that supports the compliance and a decision model for the logic of compliance. This gives us a full picture of what the regulation compliance should look like. Thanks for listening to my presentation today. I hope you found this information useful. You can reach Trisotech at trisotech.com, and my email is tom@advancedcomps.com. Have a good day.